The Subcommittee on the Western Hemisphere will come to order. The purpose of the hearing is to examine the United States foreign policy in Latin America and the results of the President's decisive action to apprehend Nicolas Maduro on January the 3rd. I ask for unanimous consent to the members from Florida, Representative Carlos Jimenez and Representative Wasserman Schultz, be allowed to sit on the dais and participate in today's hearing without objection, so ordered. And I recognize myself for an opening statement of less than 5 minutes. On January 3rd, after the fall of Maduro, the Western Hemisphere changed forever. For the first time in 30 years, Latin Americans are breathing the air of liberty. President Trump has done what no other administration has dared to do, and I'm talking about the last 30 years since Ronald Reagan. He used American strength to spread freedom and democracy in the Western Hemisphere. There's a new Monroe Doctrine now called the Monroe Doctrine. The results are evident in this hemisphere. In Cuba and in Nicaragua, the people finally have hope. In Colombia, after President Petro allowed coca crops to reach historic levels for the last 5 years, he visited the White House, met with the president, and all of a sudden, he began fighting the guerrillas in his country. In Panama, President Mulino and the Supreme Court of that country canceled the Panama Canal concessions held by a Chinese party front called C.K. Hutchinson. After decades, our neighbors are reclaiming control of their countries, and the awakening is spreading. In Peru, leaders now understand the dangers of China owning a deep water port at Chancay with the potential of something called dual usage. That doesn't have a nice connotation. Dual usage, that's a direct threat in our hemisphere, right in the country of Peru. For that reason, the new Peruvian government, which will be elected next June, must take it back, that port, take it back, and the United States will help them under the Trump administration. Across the hemisphere, nations are realizing a long-ignored truth that you cannot outsource your sovereignty to the enemies of the United States of America, period. For that reason, the hemisphere is realigning against the dictators, and thank God that Cuba is next. Cuba has always been the epicenter of evil in the Western Hemisphere, unfortunately. Tyranny is their only export. They wrote the manual on repression. But now, with this new Monroe reality, the Cuban people are full of hope, and so is Miami, the city that I represent in this honorable body. They have taken to the streets in more than 200 times in the last month alone. I'm talking about the Cubans on the island. They have even burned down the headquarters of the Communist Party in a city called Moron. Cubans have lost their fear. And even more important, they lost the belief in the invincibility of the Castro regime, which has lived in the soul of every Cuban for the last 65 years. That belief of the invincibility has been shattered by knowing that Donald Trump has not forgotten them. And the good news is that when people lose fear, the dictatorship is about to lose everything. Just days ago, the top Cuban figurehead called Díaz-Canel said on television that he was not leaving power, that he was not going anywhere. Well, Maduro, a few months ago, said the same thing, and look where he is now. For the first time, the entrenched Castro machine is vulnerable. You cannot reform a system that was built on repression. You only have to replace it. And when Cuba finally falls, it will not be the end of something. It will be the beginning of everything for the Western Hemisphere. It will be the last piece of the domino that will unleash the most consequential expansion of liberty in our hemisphere for many generations to come. The communist regime in Cuba is on life support. Trump just needs to pull the plug. I am going to say a few words now to the Cubans in Spanish. I am going to say that, can I do that right now? I'm going to say that right now, and then I'm going to allow for the ranking member give his statement. Desde el Congreso Federal de los Estados Unidos le damos muchas gracias a los que vienen a participar en esta audiencia y solamente enviarle un mensaje a los cubanos que no nos hemos olvidado de ellos, que en todo el hemisferio los aires de libertad están creciendo y que gracias a los Estados Unidos y esta nueva política del presidente Donald Trump ha traído aires de libertad al hemisferio, no solamente a Cuba, que todo indica que va a ser próximo, sino también a Nicaragua. Ya sabemos lo que pasó en Venezuela. A los peruanos que tienen un nuevo presidente en junio, le estamos enviando el mensaje que lidiar con los chinos no es una buena idea y que ese puerto tan estratégico tiene que volver a manos de los Estados Unidos y a manos de los que vivimos en el hemisferio occidental, no los chinos. Por eso le damos muchísimas gracias, no solamente a la administración, sino también a estos nuevos aires de libertad que se están sintiendo en todo el hemisferio. The chair now recognizes the ranking member from Texas, Representative Castro, for any statements he may have. You have 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you, Ambassador Kozak, for being here. I understand this is your 37th time testifying before Congress. The first time was in July of 1981. So that must be some kind of record, at least for the State Department. You have extensive experience in these matters, which makes it all the more frustrating, to be honest, that 16 months into this administration, this is the first time that we have you appearing before the committee. And let me be clear about how we got here. Regarding Venezuela, for example, the president invaded and overthrew the government of a foreign country without coming before Congress for a declaration of war or an authorization for the use of military force. He did not brief Congress before the operation whatsoever. The administration does not get to skip those questions just because the target was someone that we disliked. This operation was not a democracy agenda. In July 2024, the Venezuelan people, against enormous odds, chose Edmundo Gonzalez to be their president. Maduro and Delcy Rodriguez, who the president struck a deal with, stole that election. This administration did not invade Venezuela because it was outraged by that theft, though. And to be clear, I would not have supported an invasion to enforce the results of the election. We know why the president ordered U.S. service members into harm's way. Venezuela's oil, not democracy. There have been no credible timelines for elections, no meaningful pressure on the Rodriguez government to release political prisoners or dismantle the repressive security apparatus that remains fully intact. In fact, Delcy Rodriguez replaced one Minister of Defense, Vladimir Padrino Lopez, a man with a brutal history of torture and repression, who was sanctioned by multiple governments, including the United States, with Gustavo Gonzalez Lopez, another man with a brutal history of torture and repression, also sanctioned by multiple governments, including the United States. But the president says that she's doing a great job. The president announced the return of the Monroe Doctrine, as the chairwoman mentioned, and let me be clear about what that means. In the early 20th century, using the Monroe Doctrine as justification, American presidents used military force to secure the rights of American businesses across the hemisphere. We occupied Nicaragua and the Dominican Republic for decades to support U.S. business interests and sugar interests. We invaded Colombia, Haiti, and Honduras for similar reasons. For decades, our men and women in uniform who volunteered to protect our country became mercenaries ordered to risk their lives to protect the profits of U.S. corporations. Today, President Trump is ordering them to do so again, starting with oil in Venezuela. That is why I, along with Representatives Kasten and Senators Van Hollen and Kane, have requested that the Government Accountability Office audit how Venezuelan oil revenues are being collected and used, and also who benefits. Venezuela is not the only country in the Western Hemisphere facing credible threats of U.S. invasion under President Trump. The president has threatened Panama, Mexico, Canada, Greenland, and most urgently, Cuba. And I have no illusions about the nature of Cuba's government, but I do want to say for the record that I suspect after the war in Iran and the embarrassment that the president has suffered, that the president of the United States will likely try to overthrow the Cuban government for what he would consider a quick win. I hope the Cuban government holds free and fair elections, and they must engage in real economic reforms. All of us, regardless of party, have been pushing for that for years. Its failure to do so continues to harm the Cuban people. But we cannot ignore our own country's role in the ongoing humanitarian catastrophe in Cuba. 65 years of maximum pressure has not improved the lives of ordinary Cubans. This policy has failed. The Trump administration's latest round of sanctions and its oil blockade are causing direct harm to civilians across the island. I believe the president went into Venezuela because he saw it also as an easy win. And after the embarrassment that he's now facing, as I mentioned, I believe that he will pursue Cuba. And that would be a catastrophe for the Cuban people, for the region, and for the United States, where Americans, quite honestly, are sick of more war. This is our second hearing this Congress on Latin America with the administration testifying at a time when this administration has put the region front and center. I think it's safe to say that no president in a few generations at least has focused on Latin America in the way that President Trump is focusing on the region. So there is a lot to discuss. And the administration's naked election interference in Argentina, Honduras, and Guatemala is included in that. The illegal extrajudicial killings in the Caribbean and Eastern Pacific, for which there will be accountability at some point. The diversion of hundreds of millions of dollars in foreign assistance to fund DHS deportations. This committee must and will have a full accounting of all these actions before the president's term is up, but also, perhaps, once he's gone. I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member. And other members of the committee are reminded that opening statements may be submitted for the record. Now we are pleased to have the Senior Bureau Official for the Bureau of Western Hemisphere Affairs of the United States Department of State, the Honorable Michael Kozak, before us. Ambassador Kozak has more than 50 years of distinguished service as a U.S. diplomat, and like he said, more than 30 times in a position like this one, so I'm sure that you are not nervous, and this is nothing new for you. He has served as ambassador to Belarus, Senior Bureau Office for Western Hemisphere Affairs on 2 separate occasions, and in numerous other assignments in Latin America and in Washington, D.C. Your full statement will be made part of the record, and I'll ask you to keep your spoken remarks to 5 minutes and allow for other members to question. I now recognize Ambassador Kozak for an opening statement. And thank you very much for being here. Welcome.
Well, thank you very much, Madam Chairman, and Ranking Member Castro and distinguished members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today on how our engagement in the Western Hemisphere has yielded positive results for the American people. President Trump's national security strategy affirms the critical importance of this region to our national interests. Over the past 14 months, we've seen tremendous success on a broad agenda. Our agenda includes securing our border and ending illegal immigration, defeating the narco-terrorist groups that traffic drugs to the United States and destabilize their own communities, and expanding economic opportunities for Americans. The reassertion of the Monroe Doctrine to eliminate the influence of global adversaries and malign actors in the region is helping protect our homeland. Illegal immigrant encounters at the U.S. southwest border are down 91%. Illegal crossings through the Darien Gap were down 99% in 2025. These dramatic statistics are a testament of the President's approach. We've worked with partners to enhance control of their own borders. Our partners have imposed new visa requirements and have sanctioned and prosecuted those involved in human smuggling and trafficking. We are also facilitating the highest number of removals and deportations in history. We've negotiated asylum cooperative agreements to reduce the burden on the American asylum system. We've entered into third country national arrangements to remove aliens with no right to remain in the United States to other countries in the region. All of this upholds President Trump's commitment to making American citizens safer. For too long, Americans have been poisoned by the flow of fentanyl, cocaine, and other drugs to our open borders. We are taking action to eliminate these threats, and we are already seeing results. Drug flows are disrupted. The CDC estimates that U.S. drug overdose deaths dropped 17% in the 12 months through October 25. These efforts are saving thousands of American lives. On March 7, 2026, the President expanded our security efforts through the Shield of the Americas Summit. Leaders who share our resolve to defeat the cartels and foreign terrorist groups operating in the Western Hemisphere are now engaged as never before. Nowhere is our resolve to defeat narco-terrorists clearer than in Venezuela. We are now helping Venezuelans transition from a criminal enabler to a responsible partner. We are doing this through the three-phased approach to Venezuela's stabilization and democratic transition that the President and Secretary Rubio have laid out. The United States is assisting in safekeeping government of Venezuela funds derived from the sale of Venezuelan oil or other natural resources. These are being used for the benefit of the Venezuelan people. We see progress in Venezuela's political reconciliation. The interim government passed an amnesty law and released hundreds of political prisoners. And I'm advised that just within the last hour or so, another 50 more have been released by the Venezuelan interim government. Exiled opposition figures are re-engaging in public life. Civil society is rebuilding. These steps are essential to create the conditions for transition to a democratically elected government in Venezuela. Venezuela's interim government has enacted significant hydrocarbons reform. Treasury-issued general licenses have expanded U.S. commercial engagement. The region is also now safer. On March 30, we announced the resumption of operations at the U.S. Embassy in Caracas. This is a new chapter in our diplomatic presence in Venezuela. We are strengthening cooperation on counter-narcotics and migration. We're building economic ties that benefit America. With Maduro's arrest, Cuba lost one of its last benefactors. The end of massive subsidies at the expense of the Venezuelan people exposed the Cuban communist regime's economic failings. President Trump has made clear that we will not tolerate this threat on our doorstep any longer. Now is the time for drastic political and economic reforms in Cuba. Our vision is for a hemisphere that prevents mass migration, counters narco-terrorist groups, remains free of hostile foreign incursion, and generates economic opportunity for everyone in the region. As outlined in the National Security Strategy, we are working to enlist both our established friends and new partners in this endeavor. Over the last year, we've seen countries like Panama, as you mentioned, stand up to the influence of extra-hemispheric powers and defend their sovereignty. We've seen President Paz turn the page on 20 years of anti-U.S. sentiment in Bolivia. And we've seen partners like Ecuador and Mexico remove violent criminals to the United States to face charges. These historic achievements require our sustained support. Panama faced economic pressure after its Supreme Court nullified illegally granted port concessions that favored Beijing over Panama. As Secretary Rubio has stated, we will stand firmly with Panama. We will only increase our economic and security cooperation with this important partner. Across the hemisphere, we are strengthening critical supply chains. At the February Critical Minerals Ministerial, the Secretary signed agreements on critical mineral cooperation with Argentina, Ecuador, Paraguay, and Peru. The linkages created between the United States and our partners in key strategic sectors will benefit both sides and push adversaries out of the region. President Trump has been clear on the critical importance to our national security of U.S. preeminence in the Western Hemisphere. In the past, we took our position in the hemisphere for granted, with unfortunate results. We are now intensely focused on building the partnerships necessary throughout the region to meet our responsibility to the American people and the benefit of the peoples of the Americas. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thanks to you, Mr. Ambassador, and now I recognize myself for 5 minutes of questioning. Once again, thank you very much for being here. It's my pleasure. We definitely have a very big story happening in the Western Hemisphere like it hasn't happened in the last 30 years since Ronald Reagan. So I'm as delighted as you are. Let me just start with Venezuela, and then we go to Cuba. Venezuela. I understand what Secretary Rubio says, that we have to stabilize, we have to recover, and then we have to transition. We do not like Delcy. We don't like dealing with Delcy. Delcy is part of Alibaba and the 40 Thieves. Now, I understand that we have to deal with her. Do we, the State Department, do we have a date for the next presidential election with international observers, free and fair elections? Have we thought about a date, and can you share with us what's happening in that front?
Thanks for the question, Madam
Sure.
Chairman. We don't have a date. We have conditions that will enable an election and bring about a transition to democracy. And so we're looking at the milestones along the way. I mentioned some of them in my statement. Amnesty law, the Venezuelan interim authorities claim that over 8,000 people have benefited from that. That's not enough. There are some opposition politicians that still are unable to go back and participate, and we want to see them able to participate. You know, holding an election without people that would be able to run for it, to be able to
And
campaign.
I agree
is
with
not-
you, and then that's my next question. Maria Corina Machado, she's one of the leaders of the opposition. She wants to go back to the country. She wants to reorganize the opposition forces.
Yep.
Are we, the United States, going to give her any type of protection? Are we going to pick up the phone and call Delcy and her brother and say, do not touch Maria Corina? Not only Maria Corina, everybody else that is not part of the ex-Maduro regime.
Yes, ma'am, and I think that's been made very clear to them. We expect
Good.
all the people,
What have they answered when
including,
you have told them
including
that?
Maria Corina Machado, who I also respect very much, to be able to go back and participate freely in an election. We want election observers. The other milestones along the way, I think, as you know, the registry of voters in Venezuela is way out of date, if not completely skewed. That needs to be cleaned up and modernized. The machinery, the election machinery, election commission and the Supreme Judicial Council that supervises it are, you know, Maduro appointees that nobody has confidence in. So what we want to see is the opposition and the interim authorities agreeing on a restructuring of those so that that's in place.
Well, can we do that in tandem at the same time that we're trying to repair PDVSA and bring some American investments in the oil industry? Is there any way that we can do that in tandem and we can be telling, you understand that Delcy is not going to take any initiatives when it comes to opening up the democratic game, right? It's up to us. It's up to you at the State Department. So can we start seeing more energetic posturing from our government that that is what we want her to start doing?
Yes, Madam Chairman, and I think from
You agree, right?
yes, absolutely. And
Good.
I was going to quote also that I said President Trump and Secretary Rubio have agreed to. When we've talked about the three-phase plan, phase one was stabilization. We didn't want the security situation to break down and have people not be able to get services, to have gangs roaming around and so on, have a big illegal migration outflow. Basically, we've succeeded at that. None of those things happened. That was phase one done. Phase two, as they've talked about, is recovery and reconciliation. So those are two things that go together. The recovery of the economy by getting oil and industry revenues flowing back in again. And at the same time, as part of phase two, is the political reconciliation that will allow you to get the steps I just mentioned and then be able to move to elections.
We have to force them for their reconciliation. They're just trying to buy time.
Yeah.
They don't want to reconcile. They're Maduro.
Yeah, well,
So it's up to us.
I would say, yeah, we're not, I think we would look at it from the standpoint that we're not trusting, but we're trusting in our leverage to be able to do it. We've got very significant control over the oil revenues at this point.
And
so-
we're delighted with that, but I think that the next step that we should work on is a date for presidential elections at some point, whether it's this year or next year. We need a date, so then we can start working towards that goal. I'm sure that you agree, because the United States is not in the business of occupying. We're in the business of liberating.
Yes, ma'am.
And that is why we have to send that message. Yeah. And I'm glad that you respect Maria Corina. I knew her not long ago, but I do believe that after 16 months in a tunnel trying to defend the democracy in her country, she deserves at least our respect. Let's go to Cuba. A Russian tanker called Anatoly Kolotkin was able to deliver close to 750,000 barrels of oil to Cuba. Why did we allow for that tanker to break the siege that we had created around Cuba? Why?
I think, as the president said, he did it as a one-time exception as a way of helping on the humanitarian front. I would note that while that sounds like a considerable amount of fuel, it's about 7 to 10 days worth for normal usage in Cuba. So it's not a deal breaker. We've got very strong control on that. But the main thing with Cuba, and I served there in the late 90s, they've had this problem for a long, long, long time. People talk about the humanitarian situation in hospitals and so on. The lights were out in Cuba for about 25% of the time when I was there 30 years ago.
They're in the business of power. They are not in the business of feeding the Cuban people.
And the Cuban side generates about 40% of their oil needs anyway from their own oil wells. If they're not devoting that towards hospitals and schools and instead of sending it to Communist Party.
We know that they have destroyed the island. So can we agree that the State Department is not in any type of talks with the Castro brother, son and grandson? We know that Diaz-Canel is just a figurehead, that the real power is someone that has the Castro blood in them. And we're only talking about two people, the son and the grandson. Can you assure us today that there's no way that the United States is going to make any type of deal with the Castro family for them to stay at this hour?
No, I would just refer you back to what the President and the Secretary have said on that subject, that we're engaged with the regime, but it's with the view towards how do you get them to undertake the kinds of what I've just said, drastic reforms they need to take. Both, when you look at what's wrong with that country, it's political, it's economic, it's social. So they got to start someplace.
So what's the latest you can tell us on that conversation between us and them?
I can't go into it any further than that. But I think what the Secretary and the President have said. The goals are very clear. What will happen, it remains to be seen.
How attainable are those goals?
I think it's an estimate of, certainly we have tremendous leverage now that hasn't existed before, and it's largely because of the Cubans' own creation. They have had a system that was always dysfunctional. They were able to survive because first the Soviets gave them massive amounts of subsidies, and then they sort of colonized Venezuela and got massive free oil from them, and they sold a lot of that oil on the open market for hard currency. They don't have that anymore. And I don't see anybody else who's willing to step up and be, sugar daddy to them anymore. So they've got a problem of their own creation that they've got to get out of. They can talk to us about, if they've got some good idea that is in line with our goals. We might even help them, but it's not the kind of thing where
we're not going to do any business with the Castros. They need to go, and then we need to start all over again. I want to have courtesy with the rest of my colleagues here on the subcommittee. Just one more question.
Yes, ma'am.
I am going to ask you about Peru. I'm very concerned about this port, which is the biggest Chinese port in the hemisphere. We know that is of dual usage. For those that do not understand what dual usage means that you can go from commercial to military in a minute. That means that they could have submarines, aircraft carriers, battleships right there in Peru. There is going to be an election in June, and I just would like to hear your thoughts. I am more than willing to reach out to the candidates and ask them to work with us in order to remove that threat from Chinese hands to Latin American hands. Do you agree with what I'm saying?
Yes, I do. And I think the Peruvian government would agree with you as well. When they found out that their own court ruled that the concession that they'd done on the Chancay port meant that the Chinese were free from any kind of regulatory control by the government of Peru, it was pretty shocking.
It's immense.
Yep.
And it can harm us, and it's right there. It's like Secretary Rubio says, the problems that whatever happens in the Western Hemisphere is because the proximity to our fatherland, it will harm us first and foremost very rapidly. So I maybe we'll have another round of questioning, but now I would like to recognize Representative Kamel-Gerdove of California for 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for your persistence in bringing an administration witness to testify before this committee. And thank you, Mr. Kozak, for being here today to answer our questions. So just like with the war in Iran, it's shameful to see the administration repeat the clear foreign policy mistakes of the past, reviving a policy of domination and subjugation in the Western Hemisphere through the Monroe Doctrine, when we are still recovering from the backlash and mistrust that policy created during the Cold War, is going to set us back in terms of our relationships with the region by decades. But let's talk about Venezuela. So in January, Trump issued an executive order directing Venezuelan oil revenue to be held in U.S. Treasury accounts where the funds can be used, quote, for public, governmental, or diplomatic purposes determined by the Secretary of State. So, Mr. Kozak, has the State Department authorized the disbursement of any funds from these accounts to date?
Yes, we have. I think it's total of around $3 billion have moved through.
3 million or 3 billion?
Billion.
$3 billion. Okay, well, that's interesting because we've only been told that there's 1 billion. So how much is in the account?
That I will have to get back to you on.
All right. So you don't know, but it is at least $3 billion since $3 billion has been moved
through
okay.
during the
and so,
time period.
Where has that money, what purposes have those $3 billion been spent on?
The agreed purposes are things like paying the salaries of government workers in Venezuela, buying supplies for their oil industry, diluents and so on, other things that are benefit the public. What we've said is they cannot use the money for is things like making payments to the Chinese, to the Cubans, to the Iranians, or putting money in people's personal bank accounts, which is what was going on before.
Okay, well, I'm glad that you brought some of that up, because under this executive order, would the Secretary of State be prohibited from using the oil revenue to pay cartels in Venezuela, for example?
I don't know if the executive order would prohibit it, but the Secretary of State sure is not going to do that.
All right, but the executive order is pretty vague, so it's really at the discretion of the Secretary of State. So we don't really know if he would or wouldn't, since there is no guardrails. So under this executive order, for example, would the Secretary of State be prohibited from using the funds to pay the regime to accept deported Venezuelans from the United States?
Look, I'm not going to speculate on anything that could or could, well, especially if it's an issue of what is not prohibited versus what we are doing or plan to do. On the latter, I can tell you we have no plan to use money to pay them to take people. They already were taking people deported from the United States.
So would
in fact, they're welcoming people who want to come back voluntarily.
Well, under the executive order, would the Secretary of State be prohibited from using the funds to pay Trump donors?
This is a theoretical legal question that I'm just not going to go down that road.
Well,
And would it stop them from paying me? Would it stop them from paying you? Would it stop?
Well, I think that's those are legitimate questions. You are the senior bureau official for the Western Hemisphere
what we have agreed
affairs.
to spend it on and what we have not agreed to spend it on. But you're asking me whether a legal document prohibits, discretionary ideas, if the...
Well, sir, I am asking you that because the American people do deserve to know how dollars are being spent. I mean, the whole idea around the Doge is about being transparent and accountable.
Authorizing the money to be spent, not a law school exam on whether
this isn't a law school exam. We're talking about money. But okay, so you want to go there. Has the administration set up an independent audit system for the Treasury account holding the Venezuelan oil funds.
Yes.
Okay, so can we access it?
It's KPMG, a very well-respected audit firm, and they will be providing reports. I mean, these are
So when
after
are they
the
going to
fact, as
provide the
audits
reports?
are.
When are they going to when will they provide the reports?
I think I'll have to ask my colleagues in the Economic Bureau, but I think it's like quarterly that they'll be doing that.
So when will the next one be released?
I will have to get back to you on that.
Okay, well, please do.
Yeah, but it's in place now, and it will be retrospective too. So even though it took a little while to set up, it will go back and audit from the beginning.
And then we can see
And you can
how
see.
much has been spent, and we can see exactly where the $3 billion were spent.
You can see what the auditors find, yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you for sharing a little bit of information. With that, I yield back.
Okay.
Thank you. I now recognize Representative Jackson of Illinois for 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairwoman. Thank you for convening us. Chairwoman, in your opening statements, you celebrated the fact that, quote, the Cuban regime is on life support. Madam Chairwoman, I would say that I was in Cuba less than a week ago, and that the Cuban people are on life support, not the Cuban government. It's time to abandon a 6-decade-old failed policy that inflicts disproportionate harm on the Cuban people. The Trump administration policy towards Cuba is not new. This is now going on the 4th generation of people in our hemisphere, 90 miles off of our shore, that know nothing about the generosity of the American people. We have engaged in collective punishment. What we are seeing is a doubling down on a failed policy of deliberately depriving the Cuban people of access to basic life necessities like fuel, imports, with the hope that they will rise up and overthrow their government out of discontent. This hasn't worked for 64 years, and it is magical thinking to believe that it will work now. I will say to you that the revolution happened in 1962. Think about it. 80% of Americans were not born they have been born since 1962. This is a new world, a new America. They have suffered long off of our very shore. They have a very similar history to that of Haiti, as you know. At what point do we recognize? There are now 80 countries around the world that we have recognized since 1962. I'm asking you, what is the pathway forward? What did I see when I was in Cuba last week? I met with dissidents. I met with people that have been released from jail. I met with the president. I went to the hospitals. I went to the maternity wards. I do not believe that the American people would sit here and appreciate the administration's efforts to continue to punish the children that have just been born. I saw a child in the maternity ward named Alessandro. This child needed a ventilator, needed an incubator, the incubator and the ventilator machines, a low birth weight baby, born less than 1,000 grams, and the lights were flickering on and off. I saw women walking up and down the stairs at the hospital that were in their last trimester of pregnancy because they could not access the elevator in the maternity ward. I saw persons that were trying to do surgeries, doctors that had to, after the blackout in the hospital, had to turn on their flashlights and their cell phones to finish a surgery. It was one of the most cruel things I had ever seen in my life. I want to ask you, Mr. Kozak, do you agree with the current policy of starving this island nation of the essential resources they need in fuel so they can farm and have transportation and operate their hospitals?
Representative Jackson, first, let me thank you for meeting with the dissidents and with the others in Cuba. That's very important. But second, I have to challenge the premises of some of the assertions that you made. The Cuban government imports medicine and food from the United States, has for some time. They get hundreds of millions of dollars of food imports and medicine imports from the U.S. every year. After the recent hurricane in Cuba, the U.S. government has been supplying assistance to the victims of the hurricane. We've done it through the Catholic Church, not through the Cuban government.
Well, excuse me, Mr. Kozak, I'd appreciate it. In the interest of my time, I want to share one other thing. that they have purchased equipment from European corporations for ventilators, incubators, and because those corporations have now been acquired by U.S. conglomerates and now they're subsidiaries of U.S. corporations, they can no longer get their equipment serviced, for example. So there's a long list of corporations that continue to inflict those sort of punishments on them. I saw the roads that were empty. I saw children not being able to go to school. I saw the grocery store shelves going empty and bare with my own eyes, and this was less than 2 weeks ago. Madam Chairwoman, I would invite you to come along with me, that we go down to Cuba so that we can see this suffering of the Cuban people, children that had not been born since this government had its change. And I would ask that we have mercy upon these people, that we show them the generosity of the American people, that we not engage in this hostility. To this day, we're trying to open the Strait of Hormuz. Why? Because we say there needs to be a free flow of oil and fuel around the world for air conditioning, for
Representative
food.
Jackson, I'm going to
But
interrupt
now,
you.
and then
give me
at
more
this time, let me finish, Chairwoman.
Since
And now
you're
at this time,
inviting
we
me
have
to go to
cut them
Cuba,
off.
I would love to go
Chairwoman,
with you.
I would love to invite you, please.
Yeah, I mean, I would love to
When
go
would you
with
like to
you,
go?
and then we can definitely have an exchange of ideas. And I am delighted that you've given me the opportunity. You know, I represent the Cuban exile community in Miami.
Yes.
The Cuban exile community has been sending $8 billion for the last 10 years to Cuba. The Cubans on the island live off the work of my constituents. The Cuban regime is in the business of power, not in the business of feeding the Cubans. The Cubans, Fidel Castro has borrowed more money from Canada, from Mexico, from the
Madam
Europeans, from the
Chairwoman,
everybody.
Fidel Castro
the
is
Cubans
dead,
have been able
and he's
to,
been dead for almost a decade. I'm
You know,
talking
but
about the
look,
living, not the dead.
The Cuban, Fidel Castro, who was a genius.
And who is
was
now
able
dead.
to
Can we let him rest in peace?
No, I would want him to be burning in
I'm
hell,
not in the business of
not in
resurrection.
peace.
We've
What do
already
you mean
finished
peace?
Easter, if we will.
But,
I want to deal with the
besides
living,
that,
the
besides that,
Alessandros
let's talk
that are
about
dying right now.
Alexandro that you were talking. Alexandro, poor boy. He has
Say that
he
with
fell
contempt.
into the
I don't
hands
think
of
that's
the regime.
really appreciated.
All we're
If it was
trying
your
to do-
child and
Let me
everybody
ju-
else's
let me
child,
just-
we
let me
should be
just-
standing up for a low birth weight child.
30 seconds. These are the facts. The Cuban regime is not in the business of
Regime or
feeding.
government?
It has been an election in the last 65 years. I'm the first one who would say, have the Cubans decide who they want to be governed by. But the Cubans, unfortunately, have fallen into the hands of the most evil revolution since the arrival of Christopher Columbus in the Western Hemisphere. We're talking about someone that don't care about
since
anything.
Pinochet,
Oh, yeah. They
since,
are
there's
the
a host of
masterfuls
people that
of
we can
evil.
do.
And
We've
I'm
done
so
quite a
happy,
few
Mr.
invasions
Jackson.
ourselves.
I would love to go with you to Havana.
I would be honored.
But if you ask them, I mean, I'm sure that they will let me in with you. But
I'm sure they would.
At the end, I know who I'm representing. And I have heard the story since I was born. I wish Fidel Castro would have taken a different road, and he would have allowed for prosperity. We could be Taiwan, Singapore, Hong Kong, only 90 miles away from the United States. But he chose evil, and he chose to be in the business power over feeding his people. For that reason, the United States has been wanting to include them. Look what Obama did.
But if we are
Obama
locking,
gave the-
denying them the access to have fuel so that they can feed themselves, they
Listen,
want to purchase fuel.
your
Why do we have a military
President
blockade
Obama,
around them?
And with this we end, because out of courtesy for our witness, President Obama gave the opportunity
Did it
to
end?
the Castro regime to give him everything in exchange of nothing. And what did they do to Obama? They spit on him. Because if the Castro regime at this time, Fidel was alive, if Fidel would have said, okay, let's open up the economy. Now, these are the
President
facts,
Obama had saliva on him
Representative
from
Jackson.
Cuba?
If
Come on,
Obama,
that is a hyperbolic
the problem
language.
is that
Chairwoman, I respect you enormously.
You don't
but
want to be
this is
confused with the facts.
exaggeration, which is first cousin to fabrication, Madam
Sir,
Chairwoman.
The story says that an Obama, who was an illustrious member of the Democratic Party, wanted to include the Cubans into the international community, and look what the Cuban regime did to him. And at the end, he failed because they don't care about freedom. They only care about themselves. So thank you for the opportunity. I would love to
Thank
go
you,
to Cuba
Chairwoman.
with you.
I look
Thank you.
forward to the invitation. Thank you very
So
much.
I think
I can perhaps
your
put in
time
a
has
couple of-
expired. I think I'm going to go back to be able to. I think I recognize myself, right? No, ranking, that's right. I'm recognizing Ranking Member Castro of Texas for 5 minutes, and thank you for coming back.
Thank you so much for recognizing me. Yeah, with respect to Cuba, I think the result that we all want, I believe, is that we want the Cuban people to be able to choose in free and fair elections who they would like to elect. We would like to see a democratic Cuba, and they may choose somebody on the right, like Milei in Argentina, or somebody to the left, like Petro in Colombia, but it's not our job to pick their person for them. I also don't believe that it's our job to overthrow their government. We have tried one strategy for decades now, and here we are. In Havana, I've not been to Cuba, but the footage I've seen, the pictures I've seen, the stories I've heard say that they're still living an antiquated life in many ways from decades past. And what we're doing right now is making that life, as hard as it was, even harsher. And I do have some questions for you because I believe there is an ongoing negotiation. President Trump on February 2nd said that the United States is negotiating with the highest people in Cuba, that was a quote, to secure regime change in Cuba. In early March, Cuban leader Miguel Díaz-Canel said that Cuban officials have recently held talks with representatives of the United States government. ABC News reported in March that Secretary Rubio and his top aides met with representatives of the Cuban government at least half a dozen times in recent months. And so my question is, can you confirm for us, Congress, that Secretary Rubio is leading these talks with Cuba?
As I mentioned with the chairwoman, ranking member, I think what the Secretary and the President have said about it is about as much as I can say, that there are talks. Obviously, it's being conducted at that level with the President and the Secretary talking about it. I also wanted to...
But let me, because I need to get a clear answer. I mean, this is the oversight body. As you know, you're an old pro, 37 times now, coming before the committee, or at least testifying to Congress. You're the head of the Bureau of Western Hemisphere, and we're a career person at the State Department before that for a long time. Certainly you know whether Secretary Rubio is leading these talks, and if you can't tell us, why can't you tell us?
I'm saying Secretary Rubio and the President are certainly supervising talks. That is correct. But
So the President Trump and Secretary Rubio are supervising the talks with Cuba?
yes, and I think that's what they both have said publicly.
Is Secretary Rubio out actually negotiating with Cuba personally?
This is where I can't go beyond what
Is it classified, or?
As you know, if you want to get anywhere with talks of this kind, you don't do it in public.
Well, but I'm not asking about the substance of the conversation. I'm just asking who's representing our country as American.
Well, I think on foreign policy, it's the President of the United States and the Secretary of State. That's the lead, and that's what they have said publicly here.
Can you tell us who in the Cuban government or the Castro family are we negunegotiating with?
I think it
or
would
speaking
be
to?
for the Cuban government to make that statement, not for me.
Well, I guess the challenge is that at some point, like reluctance to answer basic questions becomes not a negotiation on behalf of the United States, but more a secret act by the Trump administration. I mean, as you know, this Congress is the oversight body that's supposed to be briefed on these issues. And the president or the secretary or whoever's negotiating with the Cubans is negotiating on behalf of not just the administration, but the country. And so that's why I ask, you won't confirm that Secretary Rubio is actually doing the negotiations, but I'm asking the other question, well, okay, well, who are we negotiating with? But you're not telling me that either.
No, and I think it's up to the Cuban side to decide whether they want to.
Whether they want to tell me
Whether they want to
who
make
their
public
negotiators are?
Who and how they are going about this.
Yeah, sir, but you know the answer to that, and you're refusing to tell me, and you're refusing to tell the Congress. Like, that's your job.
No, I'm saying that as far as I'm authorized to go, is what our
Look,
our secretary have said. And this is certainly not the first time that we've had negotiations with other governments that we are private about until they've gelled somewhere, and then obviously you come up and talk to Congress, particularly if there's anything that's being discussed that would require.
I know, well, let me say this, and I respect your long tenure, obviously. You're at the State Department a lot of years. You're obviously very much familiar with all these issues. But this is a very sensitive situation right now because the president has essentially threatened to overthrow the government of the country. And so when I ask a question about, hey, well, who's negotiating or who's on their side negotiating, and now my question is, what are the administration's goals in the negotiation? The reason that's so important for us and for the American people to know is because the president may launch a war against this country, and I want to know if there's a chance if we're going to avoid that or not.
Well, I think if you go back to what the president said, he was saying that Cuba was in a very tough place right now, as I mentioned earlier, of their own making, and that they really should be making a deal. I think the goals of the United States are laid out in the Helms-Burton Act, the Libertad Act. And they're both, it's economic, social, political changes in Cuba.
Well, let me ask you this.
But that's a wide spectrum.
Sure. I understand the Trump administration wants to use the, quote, Venezuela model in Cuba. Does that mean you expect the Cuban Communist Party to lead the transition in Cuba just like the Chavistas continue to run Venezuela? What role do you expect the Communist Party of Cuba and members of the Castro family to play in Cuba's political transition? In other words, in Venezuela, Maduro was overthrown, but Delcy Rodriguez stayed in place. So is that the goal here in Cuba?
I think the goal in Cuba is, I think as both you and Chairwoman mentioned, is to get to a point where the Cuban people can select their own leadership through a free and fair election.
But that hasn't happened in Venezuela.
I didn't say that we wanted to follow a Venezuelan model in Cuba. I don't know where that came from, but that was not my statement. What we are trying to see in Cuba is to get them, they need to make fundamental economic, political, social reforms. They need to start somewhere. I think the president has been very clear that, you know, if they start down that path, they can even get some help from us.
And then this, I know I've gone over time, but let me say this about Venezuela. I think with the Trump administration, I think the goal was oils. I think the goal was the spoils of the country. I think the goal was setting up cronies to make money off of Venezuela without real political change within Venezuela. Everybody except Maduro is still in place. And so it's making me think that the goal in Cuba is going to be the same, is who's going to go over there that's friends with the president to make money, and who's going to profit off of Cuba and the Cuban people. I want to see things in Cuba change. I think we all do. Like I said, we want to see free and fair elections. But, well, I don't believe we should overthrow the government. I especially don't believe we should overthrow the government so that a group of 6 or 10 or 12 people can make a bunch of money off of it. With that, sir, I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you, Ranking Member. I now recognize Representative Stanton of Arizona for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Thank you, Mr. Kozak, for taking time to testify at this important hearing. The United States' relationship with our allies in the Western Hemisphere, from Mexico to Canada and beyond, is crucial. Instead, unfortunately, this administration has abandoned the rule-based order. Trump has ousted foreign leaders, threatened our allies, levied tariffs without a thought to the implications at home or abroad. Trump's, quote, Don Road doctrine, unquote, claimed to put the spotlight back on the Western Hemisphere. But now, unfortunately, we are bogged down in a war in Iran with no seeming end. Our North American allies are critical to our economic and national security. The USMCA has made our economies more interdependent. The USMCA review is currently underway, but our relationships with our North American neighbors could not be more strained. The President has threatened unilateral military action against Mexico, continues to make jokes about annexing Canada, completely unacceptable. We should be doubling down on our investments in our North American allies, not backing away or taking these critical partnerships for granted. Semiconductors are a clear example of how this all fits together. My home state of Arizona is ground zero for our semiconductor industry. TSMC is there, Intel is there, CHIPS and Science Act directed historic investment into domestic manufacturing. Arizona is at the center. But we solved part of the equation and left the rest unfinished. Most critical minerals are used in semiconductors are still processed in China. Chips manufactured here are still sent to China for packaging. That means that even our domestic manufacturing has choke points that an adversary can control. And of course, it's essential that we win the economic and security battle with China. China has become a top trading partner for Latin American economies, exerting influence over critical infrastructure like ports, telecommunication networks, and access to natural resources. We have to take this threat seriously and match the CCP's economic might with our own. That's why I've been leading efforts in Congress to work with our allies in Mexico and Latin America to nearshore industries like critical mineral processing and advanced semiconductor packaging. Mr. Kozak, the State Department has only just started to reactivate projects intended to diversify semiconductor supply chains by developing the talent we need in countries like Mexico or Costa Rica. We can't afford any delays. Can we expect the department's full and continued support for all ITSE-funded projects in the Western Hemisphere?
Yes, I mean, certainly all the problems that you just well laid out, Representative, is one that we're trying to get a move on. We've gone way too far behind in letting China take over critical supply chains in the region. We have refining capacity issues that are quite challenging. So it's a huge priority for us. That's what the Critical Minerals Summit that the Secretary had recently was all about. The exact funding for the TITSE thing, I'm not sure what the respective levels are, but I know this is something that's really high on the Secretary and the President's list, so I would be surprised if we are.
We think the funding should be more, but certainly the delays that are going on, we're hoping that we can get through that and start funding these important projects. We need your continued attention and commitment to expanding and strengthening semiconductor supply chains across the region, but nearshoring semiconductor capabilities to friendly countries in the Western Hemisphere must be paired with security strategy that makes investment viable. You cannot build a reliable, secure semiconductor supply chain in regions where cartel violence creates operational risk, corrupts institutions, undermines rule of law. I've pushed for deeper security cooperations with Mexico and introduced a congressional resolution expressing deep concerns with the constitutional reforms that radically reformed Mexico's judicial system. I expect this administration is extremely concerned by these developments as well. We know it's a limiting factor for American investment in Mexico. Mexico judicial reforms will leave judges open to influence from the PRC or transnational crime organizations. Since you became the SBO for Western Hemisphere affairs, how many times has a Trump administration official spoken publicly about the judicial reforms in Mexico?
I cannot count up times publicly, but we have engaged repeatedly with Mexico on this topic. I think, as you know, we can't say that having elected judges is ipso facto contrary to good rule of law, since we have them in many states in the United States. But what we are saying, and we've been doing so in conjunction with the American investment community in Mexico, is that you need to have qualified judges that are independent, that are not in the pocket of the cartels or the Chinese or anybody else. And it's an issue of concern. We've made that clear, but I think the main push on the Mexican side is that if they want to attract investment, they need to do the things even within the framework they've adopted to make people have confidence in their judicial system that it's not going to be, misused against investors. So it's a work in progress. That's for sure.
Madam Chair, I have additional questions. I'll submit them for the record and hopefully get a written response from Mr. Kozak. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, sir.
I yield back.
Thank you to you. And now I recognize Representative Titus of Nevada for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I know this hearing is focused on Latin America, but since you cover all the Western Hemisphere, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention our northern neighbor and some of the challenges there. Madam Chairman, could I please ask unanimous consent to enter this article in the record? It says Canadian tourism in Las Vegas on a downward trend meets 2006 levels. 2006. Thank you.
Accept it.
This highlights that tourism data shows that Canadians are not coming to Las Vegas. Now, we'd have thought we'd never insult Canadians. They're our best friends and our neighbors, but we have managed to do that, and tourism by Canadians has fallen 20%, and it's a trend that can last for several years. The rhetoric has been terrible. We've called Canada our 51st state. We've said Canadians are nasty. They're about the nicest people on the planet. We've imposed disastrous tariffs. We've said they're freeloading off of our defense assistance. So, we've seen that we've pushed them away, and the Prime Minister has signed a trade deal with Canada just in January and says that Canada's stopping its reliance on U.S. defense procurement. Now, today, Mr. Trump is in my district talking about tourism and his big, beautiful bill and how it's supposed to help us, but I don't see how it addresses this issue. So what I would ask you, Ambassador, as Trump continues to refer to Canada as our 51st state, do you do that? Have you ever called Canada our 51st state in your dealings with the country? Or have you ever referred to the Prime Minister Carney or Trudeau as governors like the President has?
Well, no, I have not used those words, and I think, the President, you have to go back and look at context, and his words speak for itself in that context. What I would say, though, is we do engage with Canada quite a bit. I've had just in the last 2 weeks had a delegation down from Canada. We work together on a lot of the problems in the region, so the relationship there's still a lot there that we work together. The concern about defense spending, though, both in Canada and Mexico, is a real one. Mexico has terrible security problems, and they still are spending less than 1% of their GDP on security. So we're pushing them, as well as Canada, to step up to the plate and put more money into those activities before you get into a problem where cartels or others get out of control. So, that's the policy there. Is we're still very close partners with Canada. We're working closely with them, but we also are urging them to take some steps that may be uncomfortable for them, but we want them to do because it'll be better for both of us if they do so.
Well, I wish you'd come to my district and tell those businesses that are hurting that you're trying to make nice with Canada, so they'll come back to see us and send their tourists and buy our products. But I doubt if that it's going to be much consolation to them. Shifting back to Cuba, the Cuban people are suffering one of the worst humanitarian and energy crises in decades, if not ever, with blackouts that last 20 hours a day and little food and no sources of energy. 1 in 5 Cubans has left the country. We've been doing this same policy over and over. You've been there for 50 years. You've been involved in this almost the entire time. I think it's time for a recalibration, or maybe if you don't, you could tell us what policy change has occurred during that time as a result of this policy and why it should be continued.
Well, let me give you a little bit of a policy change that happened just recently on the fuel oil front. For some time, under the U.S. regulations, private fuel suppliers in the United States could supply fuel to private businesses in Cuba, and have done so, just like we sell hundreds of millions of dollars of food and medicine to Cuba every year. This administration just expanded that out to say that the suppliers of fuel here, we expanded the range of suppliers so that it isn't just a few companies, but anybody who wants to get in that business can do it. And that second, the recipients can be not only private businesses in Cuba, but humanitarian organizations, diplomatic establishments, churches, and this would be the way if they wanted hospitals to get fuel for their generators and so on, they would be able to do it that way. What we've seen over the years, even 30 years ago when I lived in Cuba, power was out a great deal of the time. It's not just fuel. It's the state of disrepair. The generators in Havana, when I was there, had been installed during the American occupation in 1902, and they were still trying to milk a little bit of electricity out of them. So we want to see that change. We're not trying to keep food and medicine or supplies going in to help people in Cuba. But what we were seeing before, Venezuela was sending them like 70,000 barrels a day of oil, essentially for free. And the Cubans, instead of using it to run generators, were selling like 60% of that on the open market to get hard currency that then goes into their overseas bank accounts for the
I guess
for
my
their military.
point is that we've been doing the same thing over and over for 50 years with some goal in mind, I guess to get rid of Castro, and yet the policy and the government has changed very little during that time. So apparently this policy isn't working. And you mentioned this energy change, but what we're seeing in the paper is telling the military to get ready to move into Cuba. Do you think that kind of military invasion is really the way to address a humanitarian crisis?
I'm not.
Well, maybe that reporting's not accurate, but that's what we're seeing. Thank you. I yield back.
And I just want to follow up on what my colleague is saying, is that Cuba has been the center of the hemisphere for the last 65 years. And I'm sure that all my colleagues, the Dems and the Republicans, the Cubans in Miami, the Cubans on the island, they all want the same thing, is how do we get there?
Yep.
And I just want to reemphasize, and I remember I was a journalist when Obama had this illusion or this desire, noble desire, to give the Cubans what my other colleagues have been mentioning, including the ranking member. We all want the same thing. But unfortunately, when the Castro regime realizes and understands that they are being threatened, they promise and they say anything in order just to buy more time, which is what happened with President Obama. If the Cuban regime would have given Obama what they promised, right now Cuba would be having the Chinese model. But the Cuban regime was so afraid of the Miami Cubans that they did not even allow for that to happen at the expense of the Cuban population. I just want to hear a few more thoughts about, I understand that you cannot share a lot of the information of what's going on, but if there's anything else that you can tell my constituents and the rest of the committee will be holding a classified briefing for members on Venezuela and Cuba on Monday night for any questions that cannot be addressed in this forum. But the Miami news outlets are listening to you. This is the glorious moment for my community. Is there anything else you can share to the Cubans and to this committee that you have not said before?
Well, I think one thing I would note in response to the Representative's point about the same policy for all these years, I mean, other countries have had the opposite policy, and that hasn't changed anything either. I think the Cuban regime gets a vote in this too. The problems in Cuba are not something that anything we could do or stop doing would change. They don't have the money to buy fuel because they don't produce anything. And
Only
they were
repression.
dependent on others giving them free fuel. And unless we start doing that, it isn't going to, they're not going to get out of the woods. So they need, what we're trying to do is get them to face up to the fact that they've got to come into the real world and deal with some of these problems. Now, how they
But
decide
stop right
to-
there. But you understand that their willingness has never been to deal with any of those problems. Their
Yeah.
only concern has been to stay in power
Yes, ma'am.
at all costs, with no vulnerable points, regardless of, look at what's happening in Cuba right now. No food, no electricity, no water, no medicine, no clothes, no freedom. Nothing. There's zombies being fed by people that I represent in Miami. Do you see, for what of you, the information you have, right now Fidel is dead, thank God.
Yep.
Raul is 95 years old. At that age, you don't make that many decisions because biologically you are not fit. We're talking to the son and the grandson. There's a new generation that they're my generation. Can you share with us, do these people have a different type of mentality now that they are Gen Z or millennials? They are not people from La Sierra. They did not fight in 1959.
Yeah, no, I think.
I would I would
without
like to
going in-
imagine that there's going to be a Prince Juan Carlos in that family.
Yeah. No, I without getting into who exactly, but speaking on the generational point that you're making, I think
Yes.
that is a significant difference, that you don't have people who, grew up thinking about nothing but the revolution and all of its great ideals. Now you have people who are kind of looking around, even from within the regime, saying, why are we so poor and backward? Why do we not have internet access? Why do we not have investment in our country? Why do we have the same buildings we had 75 years ago? Why do we have the same electric plants we had for 100 years? It's because they haven't been able to do anything. So there are some people, I think, who are saying, how do we get out of this? But the trouble is, as you have observed, the whole system was set up to prevent anybody from having any change or having any initiative other than the one great man.
But they don't
who
have
is
the
now dead.
resources right now to continue the repressive, and the invincibility of the regime in the minds of the Cubans is collapsing.
Yes.
Thank God that psychologically speaking, the average Cuban understands now that the regime is not so invincible because Donald Trump is at the White House. But I'm saying, let's go back to the people that hold the real power, the Castros. There are two Castros, and they're young. And one of them is the grandson, who I have seen videos of him dancing, because everyone wants to dance, consume, drink, travel, live, right? The American way. Everyone wants the abundance that we have in this society, including the Castros. He was dancing on a video saying, hey, it feels like we're in Miami. So is there any way that can you share with us what's coming from, what's in their psyche?
Well, I think what I'm saying is that sentiment is certainly out there, even within the younger generation of the regime. The question is, can they figure out a way within that system that was designed to stultify any kind of initiative or creativity or anything? Can they figure out a way to move from that to get to their aspiration of having something like Miami where they can?
They have to open up the democratic game and have the Cubans
that
allow for them to vote whomever they want
And
to be
that's where,
governed by.
if they can come to that realization and make real changes, not just promises that.
Do you
that
feel
don't
any
go anywhere.
inclination that they may, whomever we're talking to, that they may be seeing that light?
I see indications within the society, including the people in the regime, that there are people who at least think that they need to modernize in some way, whether they're ready to bring themselves to putting their own power and influence at risk. I don't know, but I think they realize also that their own power and influence is at risk simply because they're not able to produce anything anymore. They aren't able to produce outside supporters. I mean, what's really interesting is when you look around the region, nobody is running to try to bail the regime out. And our main point with the other countries has been, this is like trying to get somebody to quit smoking. You don't help them when they're suffering by saying, oh, here, I'll give you a cigarette. All that does is postpone them the day of reckoning for them, but it doesn't change the ultimate outcome. So we're saying to everybody, keep driving home to them that they are at a point where they've got to make some really fundamental decisions about their political and economic and social orientation. And if they make the right choices, there are lots of things that all of us can do to help them. If they make the wrong choices, there's nothing we can do to help them.
But there's one message that we need to send to the State Department, to Marco Rubio. I don't have to tell you, he is part of my community. He is Cuban-American, first generation, just like I am. That my community, the Cuban exile community, is not going to be willing to negotiate with anything that has to do with that regime. As my colleague was saying, the Venezuelan model cannot be possible in Cuba. It will not happen because my community will completely and absolutely repudiate the fact of dealing with anybody that has to do with the Castro regime. And that is just my message as a congresswoman, district number 27, knowing my community very well, and I'm sure that you know that too, sir. One more question, and then if the ranking member would like to ask, make a couple of more comments about Colombia. Colombia, we know that there's going to be very soon presidential elections. Two of the top contenders, Abelardo de la Espriella and Paloma Valencia, they have received death threats, and we are concerned for their safety. Colombia being one of our most important allies in the Western Hemisphere. What can we say, you, the State Department, and the United States Congress, to those who may be thinking about harming these two people?
Yeah, I mean, for the people who are thinking about harming them, they will face terrible retribution if they should even try it. But our objective is that nobody gets near enough to even try. We've have a very serious concern about those threats. After we saw Senator Uribe be killed, we've gone and talked with the Colombian authorities, particularly the Colombian National Police, who put more people on it. We've worked with them over the years on, how to run a protective detail and that kind of thing. So we're cooperating with the protective authorities to guard all the candidates against any kind of threats. But it's very concerning. Colombia, had enough years of political violence that they don't need to go back to that anymore.
Thank you. And the last question is, do you know, you're aware that the forces surrounding Maduro, when we went to capture him, were Cubans. 32 of them died because we know that Maduro did not trust their own Venezuelan guards. They needed to go to the big honcho, the repressive Cuban regime. Can you confirm that all the Cuban agents in Venezuela have left the country and they are not cooperating with the Delcy transition government?
Yeah, the information I've seen is that hundreds and hundreds of the Cubans have left, and I think I can't say that every last one is out of there yet, but they're leaving in droves, basically, being withdrawn back to and that's a good thing for the Venezuelans. The Cubans were put in all the security forces to watch after the security forces to keep them from doing anything against Maduro. And we saw that when Maduro would come to the UN, all of his bodyguards were Cubans.
Of course.
So it was unfortunate for the Cubans that they were in the way there. But yeah, I think that's been a major positive move in Venezuela, is the Cubans getting out, Iranians. A lot of the more malicious Iranians that were there are also out.
We need to see more progress towards democracy from Delcy Rodriguez. We need to see more contracts being signed, American companies wanting to invest in the oil sector in Venezuela that Delcy Rodriguez is just not signing. So we need to see from the State Department, our State Department, forcefully more actions towards the democracy and towards the free market economy, openness, and when it comes to the oil sector. And I'm sure you agree with me, Ambassador.
I very much agree. We know where we want to end up. The only observation I would make is if, 6 months ago, if we'd said we would be where we are now, everybody would have thought it was unbelievable. So, we'd like to be able to do it in an instant, but, we've had 3 months. We've made a lot of progress, but our sort of metric on this is to look, are we every day making more progress? Not, if we get stalled, that's not where we want to be. And as I mentioned in my opening statement, just today another 50 political prisoners got released. That's great, but there's still another, 250 or so that that also need to be released.
Okay. And we're here to help you. Thank you. I yield back. Now I recognize Ranking Member Castro of Texas.
Thank you, Chairwoman. And just to circle back here, I was asking earlier about the negotiations, and, I think the Chairwoman just said that she hopes that the Trump administration does not negotiate directly with the Cuban government. Yet that's exactly what I believe Secretary Rubio may be doing in the Trump administration. I think that's what's going on, right?
Yes, yes, sir.
It is, right?
Yeah,
So,
and the Secretary and the President have both said
So
that
you are
publicly.
negotiating directly
Yeah,
with Cuba? Yes,
Yeah,
okay.
And
But here's the
we've
thing.
had relationships with Cuba. We at all kinds of different levels. We have an
Right.
embassy there. They have one here. We had interest sections before that I headed up at one time.
But,
So
I
so
get
it's not that
part
we
of-
don't
part
have
of-
contact.
I got it. Part of, I guess, the irony here is that a lot of the criticism, and much of it well-founded in terms of what the Castro government, that for decades was basically a dictatorship, there weren't free and fair elections, what abused its people, was repressive of its people, and also was a communist country. But so is China. So is Vietnam. Those are some of our largest trading partners. Those are two of our largest trading partners for the United States. So I want you to tell me what the difference is between China and Vietnam and Cuba, except for geography.
Yeah, well, geography does matter, but.
Well, but
but
Cuba's also a fraction of the size of China. Doesn't have anywhere near the military. Nobody's going to argue that Cuba would overpower the United States militarily.
No,
So since we're having a wide-ranging discussion that has gone well beyond our 5 minutes for each member of Congress, please tell me what the difference is between those countries and Cuba.
yeah, I would note, though, that both Vietnam and China have made, even though they still have dictatorial governments, communist governments, they've made major changes in their societies and in their economies that have made it possible to have.
Oh, well, you believe
trading
that there's a
rela-
Uyghur genocide going on, don't you?
Excuse me?
Are the Chinese committing a genocide against the
Yes,
Uyghurs?
yes.
So what kind of changes have they made that are significant?
But in terms of, on the economic front, they have privately owned businesses, people, which have turned out to be very subversive too, in our region. But there's something there to trade with. In Cuba, they don't produce anything anybody wants anymore. They don't produce
Well, but
sugar
let me,
anymore.
but there it is,
They don't-
right? Like,
they're
so,
importing food from
but here's
us.
the point. But so is it about whether we can make money off of a country? Is that the standard? Like, I need to understand, because my concern is that the Venezuela model will become what happens in Cuba, and you don't actually replace the government. There's no free and fair elections. But what has happened now is that there's a group of folks that the president favors in his circle that is able to commence commerce and make money off of, whether it's valuable minerals, oil, anything else in Venezuela. And so now that's considered an important change that's worthy of trading and being friends with this new country. Is that what's going on?
No, sir. Not in Venezuela and not in Cuba. In Venezuela, what's going on is, I think, as we've said before, we've been able to get from an illegitimate government that we couldn't work with because it was headed by a criminal who was doing everything to thwart us, to one that we have tremendous leverage over now. It's still an illegitimate, non-democratically elected government, and we're trying to work with those people to move from where they were to where we have a free and fair election in Venezuela. Now, if you're saying is the goal the same in Cuba, absolutely.
Let me ask you on Venezuela, because you said that there have been important changes. On February 12th, the president said that Delcy Rodriguez had, quote, has done a very, very good job, excellent. On March 4th, the president again said that Ms. Rodriguez, quote, is doing a great job. He repeated that claim again on March 7th, that, quote, she's doing a great job. Do you agree with the president that Delcy Rodriguez, who has continued to detain over 500 political prisoners, has done a very, very good job, an excellent job.
Yeah. I think if.
Do you stand behind the
if-
president's
If
statement?
you're saying, did she do a good job of starting to move from where we were with Maduro to where we want to go? Yes, she's done things like release 600 or so political prisoners, more today. She's got more to go. She passed the amnesty law, hydrocarbons law, all of those things. Are those by themselves good enough? Are we going to say, problem solved, we love the way it is in Venezuela? No. But what we're saying is that those steps are steps in the right direction. She's done a good job of bringing that about in a fairly short period of time. We want to see the rest of the steps to get to the final stage where there's a free and fair election. So that includes getting a new electoral tribunal and setting up that proper machinery. We'd love to see that in Cuba too.
Sure.
Those are, I think that's one, as you said, we all share those goals. But it's how do you get from here to there?
Thank you. We got one more member who's joined us for questions, so I'm going to stop.
Yes,
Thanks.
I now, thank you. Thank you, Ranking Member, and I recognize Representative Wasserman Schultz of Florida for 5 minutes or more.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Madam Chair and Mr. Ranking Member, both my dear friends, and thank you for the extended time and allowing me to make it back as well as wave on. Madam Chair, I first want to associate myself with your remarks and your exchange with Mr. Jackson. It is absolutely not hyperbole. The repression that exists against the Cuban people by their own regime leadership, and it is a regime. It is an unelected regime that imposes horrific human rights abuses, prohibits free speech, has no free and fair elections, imprisons people for speaking their mind, deprives their people of vital nutrition and resources. This is a place that for many is hell on earth. And so I just want to make sure that that bipartisan sentiment and statement of facts is on your very important record. So thank you. Ambassador Kozak, thank you very much for the opportunity to be able to engage with you. I know you served as the Deputy Special Representative for Venezuela in 2019, correct?
Yes.
And do you recall the rationale for President Trump's decision then to cease diplomatic recognition of the Venezuelan regime and to impose broad sanctions?
Did I?
Do you recall the rationale then for President
Yes,
Trump's
yes.
decision to cease diplomatic recognition of the Venezuelan regime and to impose broad sanctions?
Yeah, it was, I think in terms of
Why
diplomat,
why did he do that? Cease diplomatic
the-
relations.
We did not have diplomatic relations with the Maduro regime because we considered it was not the legitimate government of Venezuela. The National Assembly, elected in 2015, had found the presidency to be vacant and nominated or elected Juan Guaido as the president, and we recognized him. So we maintained diplomatic relations with Venezuela. It was
Right.
just a different government.
Just with a different government, right. It was because Maduro's regime rigged the election.
Yeah, absolutely.
Brutalized their own people, jailed hundreds of political opponents, enriched themselves at the expense of Venezuelans.
Absolutely.
And Maduro didn't do that alone. He had help
Yes.
from Vladimir Padrino Lopez, Diosdado Cabello, and from Delcy Rodriguez. Today, that same regime is in power under a new U.S.-backed dictator. Free elections have not been held. President-elect Edmundo Gonzalez has not been inaugurated. Hundreds of political prisoners have not been freed, and corruption has not been punished. There is no evidence, as you've acknowledged, of a democratic transition. Some vague reference to some kind of democratic transition in the distant, unknown future is not progress, not to my Venezuelan constituents. But President Trump decided to lift sanctions on the regime, give up immense leverage in exchange for zero concessions, zero. And the chairwoman referenced in the exchange with our colleague, Mr. Jackson, earlier, that that's what President Obama did as well, which I opposed, by the way, at the time, because a relationship with the United States is earned. That is how I have always thought. And when you give away the store to a brutal regime, either in Cuba or in Venezuela, let them enrich themselves, essentially do what President Trump has done in this situation, which is essentially allow for oil profits to once again flow, then that is not progress. We have different definitions of progress if you are pointing to anything that takes steps moving forward, because we have the same oil companies that have propped up Maduro for years, and now they can make a profit. So I see you're nodding your head. So why have sanctions been lifted?
Sanctions have not been lifted, Representative. Let me go back and say how they've been modified to actually, in our view, give us more leverage than we had before. Before, the Venezuelans were able to sell oil to China. It was at a discount, but they were still making money off that, and that was money coming right to them. They did whatever they wanted with it. Large amounts of it went into private bank accounts.
Okay, if I can just point out what I mean, so I can be specific, because sanctions have been lifted. Since the removal of Maduro on January 3rd, the U.S. Department of the Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control, OFAC, has issued a number of broad authorizations, known as general licenses, to loosen sanctions on Venezuela, encourage U.S. investment in the country. On April 14th, OFAC issued a license authorizing commercial links with the Venezuelan State Central Bank and other major state-run Venezuelan financial institutions. On April 9th, the Venezuelan National Assembly voted unanimously to open mining to foreign investors in an effort to modernize the country's weak mining industry. That law was passed a month after the U.S. Interior Minister Doug Burgum visited the country along with dozens of American mining executives to meet with the country's acting president, Delcy Rodriguez. The list goes on. The U.S. government introduced limited sanctions relief for Venezuela's oil sector in early 2026 through 2 key permits tied to recent legal reforms. In addition, even assuming that all of the lifting of these sanctions is to strengthen the Venezuelan economy, which is what the argument is made, it certainly hasn't strengthened the freedom of the Venezuelan people. So I want to ask, you're arguing that these were limited sanctions relief. This is limited sanctions relief for economic recovery purposes. How was lifting sanctions on Delcy Rodriguez's personal bank accounts, and how does that help improve Venezuela's economy? Because that happened too.
Let me go back again. The key in this was we squeezed off their oil revenues by blocking the tankers and so on that were illegally moving the oil. And then when after Maduro left, what we're doing now is we gave sanctions relief in a way to ourselves by saying people can lift oil and sell it on the open market, but all that money goes into an account that we have control over. So that's very different. That's why those general licenses are there.
But there are
is to allow this to
transactions
work.
that are permitted now with PDVSA, and there has been no progress
But all
for
the-
the
all
Venezuelan
the-
people,
All the revenues that are coming from the mining sector and everything, instead of going into their bank accounts, are coming into the Treasury accounts, and then we can dole it out as we see fit, including whether we are seeing progress on the political front.
But then giving them sanctions relief certainly provides a nice cushy landing for oil barons and allowing billions to flow to people who are already rich that are not Venezuelan. Making sure that we have free and fair elections, that we recognize the elections that already took place, that we have a transition much, much more quickly than is planned now. Now there doesn't appear to be any transition planned. The president keeps saying what a great job Delcy Rodriguez has done. I have a very different definition of what great job looks like than you, as do my constituents. Delcy Rodriguez is responsible for crimes including political imprisonment, torture, state violence, massive corruption. Just because she's on your payroll doesn't change the facts on the ground. And so my constituents, and I represent a city that is nicknamed Westonzuela, and I live there, we can appreciate that some political prisoners were released, but if the same architecture of repression is still in power, and now that's backed by President Trump's political and economic support and power, then Venezuelans are still imprisoned. And that's how they feel.
Yes, I think what we're seeing in Venezuela is people are optimistic that this is going to work. That doesn't mean that they're going to be happy forever unless it is working. And as I tried to lay out, we're seeing steps, the amnesty law, the release of the political prisoners, the ability, for example, of Maria Corina Machado's party was able to retake their headquarters building and start operating again. There's been some openness in the media. It's a good first step. It's not enough to get from where we are to where we need to be. And the where we need to be part is we need all those steps. We need all political prisoners released. We need all of the political opposition, including Maria Corina Machado, to be able to go back and campaign.
But see, you're saying that. President Trump is not acknowledging Maria Corina Machado. He is not saying that there should be a transition to her party being able to ascend to the presidency and ensure that there is then a transition with a rightfully elected government that we know won the election. What we're doing here, there is still a culture of fear that is threaded deeply in and embedded in Venezuelans and in Venezuela. How are we going to make sure that that culture of fear is lifted and progress, true progress for true freedom occurs?
Okay, first I would say President Trump and Secretary Rubio have kept talking about the three-phase plan, and step 3 of the third phase is transition to a democratically elected government. So I think they are saying the same thing.
We're hearing very different things out of the president than apparently, because he disrespected Maria Corina Machado. He dismissed her. He said that she, didn't have the support of people in the country. Nothing could be further from the truth. Well, Madam Chair, can I just ask? I want to just shift gears, and because I certainly understand where you're coming from now, and you understand where I am about Cuba. So thank you very much. So what's important in Cuba is if we are going to engage in any negotiations with them, those negotiations have to result in concessions, in progress, real tangible progress, or it is completely pointless. So, and you weren't willing to answer Mr. Castro's question about the nature of the discussions, but certainly we could expect that in negotiations that there would be an expectation that if we soften our relationship with them, take steps on our side, that the binary discussions could be then they would release at least the July 21st political prisoners that did nothing more than protest in the streets and voice their opinion about their oppression. Can we acknowledge that, and is that part of the discussions, release of their prisoners?
I think we have been very clear in all publicly and privately with the Cubans that we want to see all the political prisoners released, and January 21st for sure.
Is the model for the discussions in Cuba the same as what has occurred in Venezuela? Because if it is, replacing Diaz-Canel with just a different head of the same snake is an unacceptable outcome.
I would say that the two countries are very different.
Oh, I agree.
Yeah, I mean,
they are.
Venezuela,
but President Trump said that he referenced Venezuela as a good model to repeat in Cuba.
If the good model is that a regime that was not elected and has committed all kinds of injustices and abuses over time, I mean, they both have those in common.
Well, what we can't do.
But if you can get some people in those regimes to start making real changes in the direction that we want, that's a good model.
Well, secret negotiations that result in handpicking a successor from inside the dictatorship, making a deal with the regime for a cut of their blood money, lifting sanctions on the insiders who have brutally repressed Cubans and robbed them blind and then declare mission accomplished, cannot be the way this plays out. Thank you. Madam Chair, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Representative Wasserman Schultz from the wonderful state of Florida, and I thank Ambassador Kozak for the valuable testimony and the members for their questions. The members of the committee may have some additional questioning for Ambassador Kozak, and we will ask them to respond these in writings. Pursuant to committee rules, all members may have 5 days to submit statements, questions, and other materials for the record, subject to the length limitations. Without objections, the committee stands adjourned. And once again, your patience for having stayed a lot longer than we had agreed to, this questioning was extremely valuable. So once again, thank you, and may the Lord help you, and long live the United States. I yield back.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, members.